Good morning, church. That's funny because some time ago I decided that, wow, I'd like to take some time off, but of course I wasn't going to take a whole month off. But one of the ways that I could take like a month off, what felt like a month off, was to step away from the pulpit for a month. And so it feels a little bit odd to be back. You probably didn't notice, but for the last 5 weeks, I noticed. For the last 5 weeks, I just have so appreciated being able to hear and welcome and receive the teaching and the messages from everybody else. And those included Reverend Jeffrey Kwan, obviously, who was here on January 1st and shared a message with us then. I want to give thanks for Richard, also as a lay speaker, who shared a message on the 8th when Jesus was baptized. We're remembering that day. I want to give thanks and remember Reverend Izzy, who has gone on to do national level work on economic justice, starting a new job. And I want to give thanks to Derek, who is in the back now, Becky, and Becky as Steve, or Steve as Becky, however it worked, that day, who both brought a message and shared their faith. But also, I've heard so many wonderful things over this last week about the sharing of Brenda and Jonathan and Ed, who is now, I think he's so tired from sharing that he went to Hawaii. Is laying out on a beach now, recuperating from the troubles and travails of faith sharing. But really, there's been such a richness over the last month, and I really appreciated, also want to call attention to what Derek was writing in the Messenger about the wonderfulness, the joy in our many, many ways that we've been sharing faith along the way. So I want to say thank you again for your graciousness in letting me step away, but also all the support that came in stepping up into this. A few weeks ago, you might remember President Obama gave the State of the Union address. I didn't get to catch the whole thing, but I did try to listen in as I went to pick Stephen up from the airport. And of the pieces that I remember hearing, there was sort of this theme that was woven throughout that stayed with me then and has come back even as I read the scripture this coming week. And it had to do with his talking about the mission, right? And of course, he was talking about different things, but he wove into this idea of teamwork around the mission, the sense of people coming together, having each other's backs, not kind of being partisan and saying, okay, if you're this, then I won't do this, but really keeping focused on the mission. And I have to say, when I was listening to him talk about the mission and the single-minded focus about it, it made me think of our United Methodist Church. Our mission as the United Methodist Church is what?
To make disciples for the transformation of the world.
That is a very sad state of affairs. Some of us have it all, some of us pieces, but we all can come together. Okay, so here it wants to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So let's try it all together. Our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's our mission, right? And I began to think about it because, truth be told, friends, over the last several years, there's been a lot of conversation around the church about how we have lost our mission, how we have gone astray and forgotten what our mission is, or even how to live out our mission. So a lot of the conversation has been about relearning, reteaching, reigniting the fire of the mission. It also made me think of us, of course, right here at CCUMC. And I began to wonder to myself, do we know what our mission is as CCUMC? Is it sort of really clear and unambiguous about the road that we're supposed to be walking along? And are we willing, each of us and all together, willing to put aside whatever differences that we might have with each other, or our sense of what our preferences and opinions are, in order to single-heartedly enable and support our mission. I have to say, I had a conversation and I met with Jason, some of you call him Hongjun, this last week that again brought out all of this. And he talked about stepping up for the mission. And it made me think too about whether we were willing to almost put all we had into stepping up, even beyond the limits that we thought we had, in order to follow the mission. So with those questions, I invite us into a time of prayer. Good and gracious one who sent us Jesus to show us the way to live out and capture and to be in love with you and with the call of your mission. On this day, O God, we quiet ourselves and invite our full listening to how you might be speaking to us individually and as a community about being your people. We invite you, O God, to speak. We are listening. Amen. I don't know if any of you noticed, but with the coming of Advent, we entered a brand new lectionary year. And you're thinking, wow, that's so interesting and useful to my life. We've entered a whole new lectionary year, this 3-year cycle of reading the Bible, and now we are in the wonderfully named lectionary year of B. Okay? We left A, and now we are in lectionary year B. And one of the things that happens in lectionary year B is that we, of all the 4 Gospels, we tend to focus on the Gospel of Mark. So I want to invite you to maybe take some time, it's only 16 chapters long, to read that in one of these weeks. You have a whole year ahead of you until Advent hits again, but really to pay attention to Mark. But I want to spend a little bit of time just telling you about Mark so that you might have some markers to think about along the way. One of the things to think about is Mark is actually the shortest of all Gospels, 16 chapters. I was having dinner with Val and Jeffrey one time, years ago now, and I was giving some example, and I said, oh, it's something about in Mark chapter 18. And Jeffrey looked at me and he said, there's only 16 chapters. And I have never forgotten that since then because my ears burned with redness. It's also thought of as the first of the Gospels, okay? Meaning Matthew and Luke maybe had sort of borrowed from Mark in order to tell their stories, along with something called the Q source, which, again, you need to know this for your living of life. Another thing to think about Mark in its uniqueness is that Mark seemed to not care a whole lot or put a lot of attention on the miraculous birth of Jesus. It is the one gospel that says nothing about Jesus' birth, okay? So if you were thinking like everyone told the same story, it's not true. Mark went straight for John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. The other interesting thing is he also lopped off some things at the very end. Mark, it seems that what we have at the very end about Jesus' resurrection was an addition. The original text of Mark seems to have ended with the empty tomb. So the uniqueness of Mark is that it does not contain the birth, and it ends with the empty tomb and does not go into the meetings of disciples with Jesus around the resurrection. Finally, there's another unique characteristic. I don't know if I can't remember if we meet it today, but in Mark, everything seems to happen quickly. I think Mark's favorite word is immediately. You'll read that again and again. Immediately, this is what happened. Okay? So it sort of signifies the pace at which Mark moves. And indeed, in the 10 short verses that we read today, so much happens. And I invite you to open up your scriptures if you have your own Bible or pull it out from the pew. We are in chapter 1, Mark, verses 29 to 39. Richard told us that, what were the first words? as soon, right? As soon as they left the synagogue. So a couple of things that I want you to know is Jesus and his disciples, it is the Sabbath day. And Jesus and his disciples have been at the synagogue. If we were to have read the lectionary text from last week, we would have known that he had just called his disciples, the four, Simon, Andrew, John, and James, and they had gone to a village called Capernaum. And there they had entered the synagogue because it was the Sabbath. And two things happened at the synagogue that are of note. The first thing is that Jesus taught. And it didn't seem like any ordinary teaching. It was sort of like, do you remember when you hear somebody and you think, wow, now that is so full of insight or so deep that that is powerful. And that's what happened for Jesus. He went into the synagogue, started teaching, and people really noticed that he was teaching with authority. The second thing that happened was that someone came to him who had an unclean spirit, and Jesus cast that unclean spirit out. And again, the people gathered there were amazed by his power to do such a thing. And it's as that happens, after he has taught and cast out the unclean spirit, that they are now entering the home of Simon Peter and Andrew, his brother, right? So I want you to think about, wow, it's been a full day already, right? He's already gone to church. He already did his preaching. And he also did some healing work on the side. And now you would think that he wants to go home and just maybe like chill out, right? Hang out, have a nice meal, talk with his disciples about what they saw and learned along the way. But as soon as he gets there, what do we learn? Somebody tells him that Simon's mother-in-law has a fever and is sick there, right? That's what we read. Now, a couple of things I want to point out. The first thing is, it's interesting to note that the reason Simon's mother-in-law is living with him indicates that she is a widow. She does not have a husband nor any male children left, and that is why she is living with her daughter. So in some ways, the fact that now Jesus has called Simon and Andrew away to follow him is a big deal. They're about to leave her alone once again. You might think about the path of Jesus is not an easy one in which we get to take everything and everyone we love with us necessarily. So he enters this home, right? And there is this woman who's sick. And it's interesting because they tell him, and what does Jesus do? He does something that is sort of against Jewish teaching. He reaches out his hand, the text says, takes her hand and raises her up. The word in Greek is the same word as the word for resurrection when Jesus was raised up. So we might think about two things with that. First thing is healing. We don't want to forget the touch that often goes with healing and the need for us to reach out to another for healing to occur. The second thing is we might remember is, wow, it is like we are raised up again. And what happens when raised up? I have to say, I sort of snickered when I read this the first couple times. What kind of story is this? The woman has just been sick with fever and now she's serving dinner. That's why Jesus raised her up? Right? But in fact, that word serve is sort of interesting also because we learned that that word serve is used very few times and has to do with the service of all of Jesus' disciples. So we also want to consider, I'm going to let go of that kind of like, what? Why should she be serving dinner, right? And glory and enjoy the fact that she is raised up to be of service. We are healed, brothers and sisters, in order to encounter and enable service to happen. And what happens then is then the sun goes down. You probably do get a meal in there somewhere, right? Simon's mother-in-law feeds them all. But as soon as the sun is down, we find that all the sick folks and all those who are demon-possessed are now at the door. Another thing you should know about Mark, he likes to exaggerate. So it's like the whole city is out there with so many people, right? Maybe there are 5, I don't know, right? But the fact is that somehow people have heard of this healer and have brought their brothers and sisters, loved ones and friends to this man in which they hope to have healing. And Jesus, in fact, encounters at work. The next thing that we know is that it's very early in the morning. So early that it is still dark. And you would think that Jesus, I hope he's an introvert, is so tired by now. But instead of like sleeping his full 8 hours, what does he do? Where do we find him? Praying. He's out in a deserted place praying. This morning I really appreciated in the Chinese language service, the preacher talked about how the character for busy, and Jesus has certainly been busy, right, is made up in Chinese of the root of heart and the side of death, right? Heart and death. So the sense is when we're too busy, our hearts die. When we're too busy, our hearts die. And how do we recover from that death? Jesus shows us through going to a deserted place and praying. Jesus allows that time to refocus himself, right? To get centered, to kind of hear and listen and renew his energies. We might want to think about that sometimes because we at CCUMC are a bunch of amazing doers, right? We love doing. We will get together and we'll move that soundboard and sure the carpets get moved. We'll clean the place. We'll do this. We'll do that. We'll go and change the world Sunday and we'll have this dinner and we'll do all kinds of things. But the question to ourselves is, are we taking enough time out in a deserted place to pray? And here we'll get into why this is important. Because as Jesus is praying, people come to him, right? His disciples. They come, they're looking for him. And they say to him, everyone has been looking for you. I wonder how Jesus felt about that, right? Was he like, oh my gosh, here we go again? Or was he like, yes, let's go. But here's a very interesting response. When the disciples tell him everyone is looking for you, it's sort of like they're saying, wow, there were so many people out there that needed healing. We need to get back to work because the line is probably out the door by now. Right? There are people waiting for you at the door of my home. You've got to show up, man, right? And do your thing. But does Jesus say, yes, sure, let's go back? What does he say? Would you look with me? I think we are close to 37. He says what, Brenda?
Go to a neighboring town.
Yes, he says, let us go to a neighboring town so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do. Is that what you expected Jesus to say? After, like, everybody's looking for you to come and do this healing. And he's like, oh, yes, thank you. Let us go to a neighboring town. Right? It's a little bit of a break and a strange thing to do. But here's the thing that I want to call your attention to, those last words that he said. For that is what I came out to do. Jesus knew what his purpose and mission were. And I want to suggest, friends, that in the midst of all that he did, that time of prayer allowed him to focus and refocus on what his mission and purpose was, so that when somebody and people he loved and cared about came to him and said, there's a need there, he was able to discern and distinguish what he needed to do. He didn't say, oh yes, and he didn't get pulled this way and that and start feeling so crazy by all the competing needs. He didn't say, my goodness, you're right, there's all these people there. He said, my mission is to go and proclaim that God's kingdom has come near. And we see that through the healing and through the casting out of unclean spirits. But I came first and foremost to proclaim that God's kingdom is near. One of the commentators that I read about this talked about how this is the first time that the disciples' intentions and Jesus' intentions and expectations came into clashing, right? They wanted him to simply be a miracle worker and to be a loyal son of the village. And he had a sense of his mission. Jesus' primary goal, we have to remember, is not to be a wonder worker, just for you and to answer our prayer, but to enable transformation, for the transformation of the world to happen. Someone also suggested that in this conversation of just everyone is looking for you, let us go to a neighboring town, that in that we see a snapshot of leadership. And the snapshot of leadership has 3 points. They are to stay on the mission. Stay on the mission. The second is to not get distracted by worthy, but not mission-related needs. Not get distracted, friends. And the third thing that I don't think we often think about is paying the price of disappointing some people and their subsequent gossip and criticism in order to serve your mission. There's a cost, is what they're saying, to staying on the mission. There's a cost to staying on the mission. I was reminded by these words. We certainly would not be here today if Jesus had stayed home like a loyal local son and healed the good folks who needed him there. So what does this all mean to us here at CCUMC, right? What are we supposed to do with it? The first thing is I want to suggest is know thy mission, friends. Know thy mission. Don't just be able to say, oh, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, right? But to know it, to really unpack it, to study it, get to know what that means. The second thing is, I want to suggest that we continuously need to discern all through prayer. I think it was Steve. I'm back, so I get to pick on you. Steve, who will often make fun of me because in meetings, I'll say, you know, we need some time for discernment. We need to actually pray about this before we move on into decision making. And that really, prayer time is about listening, about refocusing and recentering. Not so that out there changes, but so in here changes. So know thy mission, discern all through prayer. Third thing is stay focused. Don't get distracted. In a little second, we're going to be able to hear from Jason. He has a wonderful faith sharing that I've invited him to share. But really, these come from listening to him about, gosh, he knows where he has to go, and it's so easy to get distracted by your hurting leg or your growling stomach or your mind that is just starting to feel tired. But the need to stay focused, not get distracted, is what enables the mission to happen. And the last one, friends, that I think we'll begin to talk about here at CCUMC sometimes is be willing to pay the price. Be willing to pay the price. Our mission, friends, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Let us enter this new year ready and willing to follow Jesus to the neighboring towns, right? To those neighboring towns and wherever else he may take us, and proclaim through our word and our deed that God's kingdom of love and healing, of transformation and grace have come near. I want to invite Jason. Come on up. Would you take a deep breath? You've been such wonderful listeners for so long. I primed the pump for you. Now they're really tired. But I know that they'll listen. So for those of you who might not know, Jason left CCUMC in the Bay Area at the end of October, very end.